The millionaire dressed as a homeless man to test his son and was completely devastated. Welcome to another incredible story that will shake you to your core and make you question everything about family, values, and what truly matters in life. Today, you're about to witness a father's desperate attempt to understand his son's character and the devastating truth he discovered that changed both their lives forever. If stories about real human drama, family relationships, and life-changing revelations move you, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and ring that notification bell so you never miss these powerful real-life stories that will make you reflect on your own values and relationships. Now let's dive into this heartbreaking journey that will leave you speechless and questioning everything you thought you knew about privilege, compassion, and what it really means to be successful. The morning sun cast long, golden shadows across the meticulously manicured lawns of Beacon Hill, Boston's most exclusive and historic neighborhood, as William Chen stood motionless at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse study. At 58 years old, William had built an empire worth over $300 million through his innovative biotech company, Chen Therapeutics, which specialized in breakthrough treatments for rare genetic diseases. His journey from the son of Chinese immigrants who ran a small grocery store in Chinatown to one of Boston's most influential business leaders was the stuff of American dreams. But success had come at a price he was only now beginning to fully comprehend and grapple with. His reflection in the pristine glass showed a man who possessed everything that money could buy: perfectly tailored suits from Savile Row, a Swiss watch collection worth more than most people's homes, and access to exclusive circles that most could only imagine. Yet as he stared at his own image, William felt emptier and more troubled than he had at any point in his meteoric rise to financial prominence. The weight of recent revelations about his only son's character pressed down on him like a suffocating blanket, making even his extraordinary success feel hollow and meaningless. The opulent study around him told the comprehensive story of his remarkable achievements. Walls lined with prestigious awards from medical organizations, framed photographs capturing moments with presidents, senators, and celebrities, and a massive mahogany desk that had cost more than most people's annual salaries. Behind him, the familiar sounds of his extensive household staff, preparing for another day, echoed through the halls of his 12,000-square-foot mansion, a testament to wealth and luxury that few could even comprehend, let alone attain. But today, William's mind wasn't occupied with thoughts of his extraordinary success, his groundbreaking company, or his substantial fortune. Instead, he was consumed by a growing concern that had been eating at his soul for months, perhaps even years, like a cancer that grew stronger with each passing day. His relationship with his only son, Marcus, had become increasingly strained and troubling, and William couldn't shake the devastating realization that he had somehow failed catastrophically as a father, despite providing every conceivable advantage, opportunity, and privilege that money could offer. Marcus Chen, 26 years old and the heir to his father's empire, had graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Business School and now held a prestigious senior position at Goldman Sachs, one of Manhattan's most powerful and influential investment firms. On paper, examining his credentials and achievements, Marcus was everything any parent could be proud of: intellectually brilliant, professionally successful, socially well-connected, and financially secure beyond most people's wildest dreams. He moved in elite circles, owned a luxury apartment on the Upper East Side, and had access to opportunities that most young people could never imagine. But beneath this glossy surface of achievement and privilege, William had noticed deeply troubling signs in his son's character that kept him awake at night, staring at the ceiling and wondering where he had gone so terribly wrong in raising the boy he had once loved unconditionally. These weren't minor personality quirks or momentary lapses in judgment. They were consistent patterns of behavior that revealed something fundamentally disturbing about who Marcus had become as a human being. During their most recent dinner together at Mistral, one of Boston's most exclusive and expensive restaurants in the affluent Back Bay area, William had watched in growing horror and dismay as Marcus berated a young waitress who appeared to be working her way through college. The incident had started when she brought the wrong vintage of wine to their table, a simple mistake that could happen to anyone in a busy restaurant environment. But Marcus's reaction had been swift, brutal, and completely disproportionate to the minor error. His voice had dripped with contempt and superiority as he loudly demanded to speak to the manager about her complete incompetence and unprofessional behavior. He had humiliated the young woman in front of other diners, treating her not as a fellow human being who had made a simple mistake, but as something less than human, unworthy of basic respect or consideration. This is exactly the kind of sloppy, pathetic service that ruins fine dining establishments, Marcus had declared, his voice carrying across the restaurant and causing other patrons to turn and stare. When you hire people who clearly don't belong in a place like this, you get exactly what you deserve: mediocrity and embarrassment. Deal. The waitress, probably no older than 22, had stood there with tears forming in her eyes as Marcus continued his verbal assault, her face flushed with humiliation as she apologized repeatedly while trying to maintain her professional composure. William had watched in stunned silence as other diners observed the scene with obvious discomfort, some shaking their heads in disapproval at his son's behavior. "I want her removed from our table immediately," Marcus had continued, his tone suggesting he was discussing the disposal of garbage rather than addressing a human being. "And I want a significant discount on our bill to compensate for this completely unacceptable experience. People like her need to understand that there are consequences for their failures." The incident had lasted only a few minutes, but it had revealed something about his son's character that deeply disturbed and frightened William. This wasn't just rudeness or impatience born from stress. This was calculated cruelty directed at someone who was in a vulnerable position and couldn't fight back without risking her job and livelihood. But that dinner wasn't an isolated incident or a momentary lapse in judgment. As William reflected on recent months, he realized he had been witnessing a consistent pattern of disturbing behavior that he had initially tried to excuse or rationalize as the stress of young professional life or temporary personality adjustments that would improve with maturity. Marcus seemed to treat service workers, delivery drivers, parking attendants, and anyone he perceived as beneath his elevated social and economic status with a casual, almost reflexive cruelty that made William's stomach turn with disgust and shame. When confronted about these behaviors during their private conversations, Marcus would simply shrug dismissively and claim that demanding excellence and maintaining appropriate social boundaries were signs of successful leadership and realistic understanding of how the world actually functioned. "Dad, you're being too sensitive," Marcus would say whenever William attempted to address these concerning behaviors. "Successful people maintain standards and expectations. If you don't demand excellence from the people who serve you, you're just encouraging mediocrity and incompetence. I treat people appropriately according to their position and performance. That's just being realistic about social hierarchies and economic realities." The transformation hadn't happened overnight, which made it even more painful and bewildering for William to comprehend. He vividly remembered Marcus as a kind, curious, and empathetic child who would eagerly share his toys with less fortunate kids at school, and always remembered to say please and thank you without being reminded. Young Marcus had been the type of child who would cry when he saw injured animals and insist on helping his parents donate food to homeless shelters during holiday seasons. But somewhere along the way, perhaps during his formative teenage years at Phillips Academy, one of New England's most elite and exclusive preparatory schools, or during his time at Harvard surrounded by other privileged young people from America's wealthiest families, something fundamental had changed in Marcus's character and worldview. The sweet, compassionate boy had gradually transformed into a man who seemed to measure everyone's worth and value exclusively by their bank account balance and social position. William had tried every approach he could think of to address this troubling evolution in his son's character. He had attempted direct conversations about empathy and human dignity, gentle corrections when he witnessed inappropriate behavior, and even serious threats to reduce or eliminate Marcus's substantial trust fund if his conduct didn't improve. But nothing seemed to penetrate his son's armor of entitlement and arrogance, which seemed to grow stronger and more impenetrable with each passing month. Marcus would nod politely during their serious conversations, promise to reflect on his father's concerns and do better in future interactions, and then return to his old patterns of behavior as soon as he thought his father wasn't watching or paying attention. It was as if he had developed two completely different personalities, one for his father and family, and another for the rest of the world, especially those he considered beneath his notice. The absolute breaking point had come just 3 weeks earlier, when William had made an unexpected and unannounced visit to Marcus's luxury apartment building on East 72nd Street, in Manhattan's exclusive Upper East Side neighborhood. As he approached the elegant marble and brass entrance, he had spotted Marcus emerging from a gleaming black Tesla Model S, tossing the keys to the building's uniformed valet with barely a glance or acknowledgement of the man's existence. An elderly, homeless man, probably in his 70s, with weathered, gentle hands and kind but weary eyes, had been sitting quietly on the sidewalk nearby, with a small cardboard sign asking for help. The man hadn't been aggressive or intrusive. He had simply asked in a soft, polite voice if Marcus might have any spare change to help him get something to eat. Marcus's response had been swift, brutal, and utterly without compassion or basic human decency. "Get away from me, you disgusting parasite!" Marcus had snarled with genuine hatred and contempt, actually shoving the elderly man with his shoulder as he passed. "Go get a job instead of bothering people who actually contribute something meaningful to society. You're nothing but a worthless drain on resources that could be better used by people who matter." Ein, the homeless man, who despite his obvious struggles maintained a dignity that Marcus seemed incapable of recognizing, had simply nodded quietly and moved away without protest or argument. He hadn't cursed or responded with anger. He had just accepted the cruelty with the resigned patience of someone who had experienced similar treatment many times before. But William had seen the hurt and resignation in the old man's weathered face, and it had broken something fundamental inside him that he wasn't sure could ever be fully repaired. This wasn't just rudeness or impatience, or even typical young adult selfishness. This was calculated, deliberate cruelty directed at someone who was already suffering and had no power to defend himself or retaliate. That night, William had lain awake in his Boston mansion, staring at the ornate ceiling of his master bedroom and wondering how his son had become someone he barely recognized and couldn't respect. All the money he had spent on the finest schools, all the opportunities he had provided, all the advantages he had carefully arranged, and all the love he thought he had demonstrated seemed to have produced a person completely lacking in empathy, compassion, or basic human decency. The more William thought about the situation during those long, sleepless nights, the more he realized he needed to understand the true depth and extent of the problem he was facing. Was Marcus's behavior just occasional lapses in judgment that could be corrected with proper guidance and consequences, or was it something more fundamental and deeply rooted in his character? Was there still hope for change and growth? Or had his son become irredeemably selfish, cruel, and indifferent to others' suffering? The idea that would eventually lead to the most devastating and transformative experience of both their lives had come to William during one of those sleepless nights. Born. from desperation, love, and a father's stubborn refusal to give up on his child. If Marcus treated people differently based on their perceived social status and economic position, then William needed to see how his son would treat someone at the very bottom of that hierarchy. Someone who appeared to have nothing, no power, no status, no connections, and no ability to help or harm him in any way. William would disguise himself as a homeless person and approach his son, creating a test that would reveal whether any trace of compassion, empathy, or basic human decency remained in the young man he had raised with such high hopes and expectations. It was a drastic, potentially dangerous plan that could seriously damage their relationship if discovered, but William felt he had exhausted all other options and needed to know the truth about his son's character, no matter how painful that truth might ultimately prove to be. The plan required extensive, careful preparation that consumed William's thoughts and energy for days. He couldn't simply throw on some old clothes and expect to pass as someone experiencing homelessness. The disguise needed to be convincing enough to fool his own son from close range, someone who had known his face, voice, and mannerisms for more than 2 decades. William spent countless hours researching and studying the appearance, mannerisms, and behaviors of people living on the streets, learning about their daily struggles, survival strategies, and the subtle signs that marked them as society's most vulnerable and forgotten members. He visited libraries and social services organizations, read academic studies about homelessness, and even discreetly observed people experiencing homelessness in Boston's downtown areas to understand how they moved, spoke, and interacted with the world around them. He visited Theatrical Threads, a specialized costume and makeup supply shop in downtown Boston that served the city's numerous theater companies and film productions, where an experienced artist named Margaret helped him select pieces that would completely transform his appearance and create a believable homeless persona. Margaret had worked in theater for over 30 years and understood the importance of creating authentic-looking characters that could withstand close scrutiny. Grey contact lenses would change his distinctive brown eyes, while a carefully crafted fake beard would obscure the sharp, well-maintained lines of his face. Professional-grade theatrical makeup would add lines, weathering, and the pallor of someone who lived without proper nutrition, medical care, or shelter from the elements. Special techniques would make his usually perfect teeth appear stained and damaged, while carefully applied dirt and grime would create the appearance of someone who had been living rough for months or years. The clothing came from multiple carefully chosen sources to create an authentic appearance. Worn, cracked boots from a Goodwill thrift store, tattered jeans with realistic stains and holes, and a faded jacket that had clearly seen much better days. Layer upon layer of shirts would make him appear bulkier while hiding his well-maintained physique, and a knit cap would conceal his professionally styled hair. William practiced walking with the slightly stooped posture of someone carrying invisible burdens of exhaustion, despair, and physical discomfort. He learned to speak in a softer, more hesitant voice than his usual commanding tone, and studied the subtle body language of defeat and resignation that characterized many people experiencing long-term homelessness. Most importantly, William researched the backgrounds and personal stories of people experiencing homelessness, understanding that a convincing portrayal required more than just appearance and mannerisms. He needed to be prepared with a believable backstory if Marcus engaged in any conversation. Details about job loss, medical bills, family troubles, mental health struggles, and the cascade of misfortunes that could reduce anyone to life on the streets. He learned about the various paths that led people to homelessness, factory closures that eliminated entire communities' economic foundations, medical emergencies that destroyed families' financial security, mental illness that strained support systems beyond their breaking points, domestic violence that forced people to choose between safety and shelter, and addiction that consumed everything in its path, while society looked away in disgust rather than offering help. The transformation process took nearly 4 hours to complete in the privacy of his mansion's guest bathroom, far from the curious eyes of his household staff. As William worked with the makeup, clothing, and accessories, he felt himself becoming someone entirely different, not just in appearance, but in his understanding of what it meant to be invisible and powerless in American society. Looking at himself in the mirror after the transformation was complete, William was startled by how effectively the disguise worked and how uncomfortable it made him feel. The well-groomed, confident businessman had vanished completely, replaced by a tired, weathered man who looked like he had been worn down by years of hardship, disappointment, and societal neglect. His hands, usually manicured and soft from a life of comfort and luxury, now appeared stained, rough, and damaged from exposure to the elements. His expensive Swiss watch was hidden beneath frayed shirt cuffs, and his perfectly maintained physique was concealed under layers of worn clothing that suggested malnutrition and poor health. Even his own reflection seemed to be that of a complete stranger, someone who might be overlooked, avoided, or actively despised by the very son he had raised to be successful and privileged. The psychological impact of the transformation was profound and disturbing, giving William a tiny glimpse into what it might feel like to be truly powerless and unwanted in a society that increasingly seemed to blame the poor for their circumstances rather than addressing the systemic issues that created poverty and homelessness. William chose a Wednesday afternoon for his devastating test, knowing from previous observations that Marcus typically left his Goldman Sachs office around 4 o'clock for client meetings, social events, or early dinner appointments. The location would be outside Marcus's luxury apartment building on East 72nd Street, the exact same place where William had witnessed his son's shocking cruelty to the elderly homeless man just 3 weeks earlier. The drive from Boston to Manhattan gave William plenty of time to rehearse his performance, practice his backstory, and steel himself emotionally for what he might discover about his son's character. Part of him still hoped desperately that Marcus would show kindness, compassion, or at least basic human decency to a stranger in need, proving that his recent disturbing behavior had been aberrant rather than characteristic of his true nature. But a growing dread in his stomach, a cold weight of fear and anticipation, suggested that the test might confirm his worst fears about what his son had become under all the privilege, education, and opportunities he had provided. The very fact that such a test seemed necessary was itself a devastating indictment of his failure as a father and Marcus's failure as a human being. Manhattan's Upper East Side buzzed with its usual afternoon energy and expensive chaos as William positioned himself carefully on the sidewalk near Marcus's exclusive building. Well-dressed professionals hurried past with focused expressions, their faces buried in phones or consumed with thoughts of important meetings and social obligations, barely acknowledging the presence of someone who appeared to be experiencing homelessness. The few passers-by who noticed William at all quickly looked away, their faces showing uncomfortable mixtures of guilt, disgust, and relief that his problems weren't theirs to solve. Some crossed the street to avoid walking too close, while others simply stepped around him as if he were an obstacle rather than a human being. The experience of being invisible and unwanted was profoundly disturbing, even though William knew it was temporary and chosen rather than the result of genuine desperation. William had been waiting for approximately 25 minutes, watching the ebb and flow of privileged life on one of Manhattan's most expensive streets, when he spotted the familiar figure of his son emerging from the building's marble and brass lobby. Marcus was impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that William recognized as costing several $1,000s, his appearance polished, confident, and radiating the kind of casual arrogance that came from never having to doubt his place in the world's social and economic hierarchy. Marcus moved with the assured stride of someone who had never experienced real adversity, never questioned his own worth or value, and never considered that his success might be partially the result of advantages rather than purely personal merit. His expensive leather shoes clicked confidently on the sidewalk as he approached the spot where William sat hunched against the building's impressive facade, trying to look as small and unthreatening as possible. This was his son, William reminded himself, as his heart pounded with anticipation, anxiety, and dread. This was the boy he had held as a baby, comforted through nightmares, taught to ride a bicycle, celebrated with at graduation ceremonies, and loved unconditionally for 26 years. In just a few moments he would discover whether any trace of that loving, compassionate child remained beneath the surface of privilege and entitlement. "Excuse me, sir," William said in the soft, hesitant voice he had practiced for hours, looking up at Marcus with what he hoped appeared to be desperate hope mixed with resignation. "I'm really sorry to bother you, and I know you're probably busy with important things, but I haven't eaten anything in 2 days. Could you possibly spare just a few dollars for food? I'm not asking for much, just enough for a meal or maybe a cup of coffee. I understand if you can't help, but I thought I'd ask." The request was deliberately humble, specific, and non-threatening, exactly the kind of plea that might touch the heart of someone with even the most basic level of human compassion and empathy. William had deliberately mentioned food rather than money in general, hoping to appeal to the fundamental human understanding that everyone needs nourishment to survive, regardless of their circumstances or perceived failures. Marcus stopped walking and looked down at the man he didn't recognize as his father, his expression shifting through several emotions in quick succession. For just a moment, William felt a flicker of hope as he thought he saw something that might have been recognition of their shared humanity in his son's eyes. Perhaps beneath all the privilege and arrogance, some trace of basic human decency remained. But what happened next shattered William's heart and destroyed his faith in his son's character in ways he hadn't imagined possible, even after witnessing months of troubling behavior and preparing himself for the worst possible outcome. "Are you out of your fucking mind?" Marcus exploded, his voice filled with such disgust and contempt that it cut through William like a physical assault. "Do you honestly think I worked my ass off to get where I am just to hand out money to pathetic losers who can't take care of themselves? What kind of delusional entitlement makes you think you have any right to ask me for anything?" The words hit William with devastating force, each syllable confirming his worst fears about his son's character while revealing depths of cruelty he hadn't fully comprehended. But Marcus was just getting started with his verbal assault on the man he believed to be a desperate stranger asking for help. "Look at yourself, you disgusting piece of garbage," Marcus continued, his voice rising and attracting attention from other pedestrians who slowed down to watch the confrontation. "You're what, 60, 70? And you're sitting on the street begging like a fucking animal instead of contributing anything meaningful to society. You're a complete waste of oxygen, and honestly, the world would be significantly better off without parasites like you." William felt tears beginning to form behind the grey contact lenses as the full weight of his son's cruelty became clear. But Marcus wasn't finished with his devastating attack on someone he perceived as powerless and vulnerable. "You know what your fundamental problem is?" Marcus leaned down slightly, his voice taking on a lecturing tone that dripped with superiority and contempt. "You expect other people to solve your problems instead of taking personal responsibility for your own pathetic failures and poor life choices. I guarantee you that every single disaster in your miserable life was the direct result of your own stupidity, laziness, and weakness. And now you want successful people like me to pay for your mistakes and bad decisions." The irony was absolutely devastating and almost unbearable for William to process. Marcus, who had been given every conceivable advantage from the moment of his birth, who had never faced real adversity or genuine struggle, who had been protected from failure by family wealth and connections, was lecturing someone he believed to be homeless about personal responsibility, hard work, and individual merit. The son who had inherited opportunities that most people could only dream of, who had attended the finest schools because his father could afford the tuition, who had secured prestigious internships through family connections, who had never worried about basic necessities like food, shelter, or medical care, was attributing his success entirely to his own efforts, while condemning others for circumstances he couldn't begin to understand or imagine. "I've got news for you, you pathetic old man," Marcus continued, his voice rising to a level that was clearly audible to everyone within a 50-foot radius. "The reason you're sitting there in your own filth like a piece of human garbage is because you're fundamentally weak, stupid, and worthless. You're a complete failure as a human being, and no amount of charity or government assistance is going to change that basic fact about who you are and what you represent." William wanted desperately to stand up, tear off his disguise, and confront his son with the truth of what he was hearing and witnessing. But he forced himself to remain in character, knowing that this moment was revealing something essential about Marcus's nature that couldn't be taken back, explained away, or rationalized as temporary stress or poor judgment. "Please, sir," William managed to whisper, his voice breaking with genuine emotion that had nothing to do with his performance, and everything to do with watching his son reveal himself to be a person without basic human empathy or compassion. "I really just need something to eat. I'm not trying to take advantage of anyone. I just haven't had food in days, and I thought maybe—" "And I'm not giving you a single fucking penny," Marcus interrupted with absolute finality and disgust. "You want food? Get a job, assuming anyone would be desperate enough to hire someone as pathetic as you. You want respect. Earn it by actually contributing something to society instead of being a drain on resources. You want people to care about you. Stop being a disgusting burden on decent citizens and become someone actually worth caring about." With that declaration, Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out his expensive iPhone, making a dramatic show of dialing a number while maintaining eye contact with William. "You know what I'm doing right now? I'm calling the police to report you for harassment and aggressive panhandling. People like you shouldn't be allowed to bother decent citizens who actually matter. They can move you along to whatever homeless shelter will take you, assuming any of them want to deal with your kind." The threat to call the police was the final act of cruelty, an attempt to use institutional power and authority to punish someone whose only crime had been asking for help in a desperate situation. William realized with crystal clarity that his son wasn't just indifferent to human suffering. He was actively hostile to it, seeing vulnerability and desperation as things to be attacked, punished, and eliminated rather than aided or understood. As Marcus held the phone to his ear with theatrical flourish, William slowly and carefully stood up, his movements deliberate and measured, despite the emotional turmoil churning inside him. The physical discomfort of being in character paled compared to the emotional agony of witnessing his son's true character, but he knew that this moment required careful handling to achieve maximum impact. "Wait," William said, his voice stronger now as he began to drop the homeless persona and allow his natural authority to emerge. "Before you make that call, there's something very important that you need to know." Marcus looked annoyed by the interruption, his finger still hovering over the phone's screen as he prepared to complete his threat. "What could you possibly have to tell me that I would want to hear? Make it quick before I have you arrested for harassment and disturbing the peace." William reached up with steady hands and slowly removed the knit cap, revealing his distinctive salt and pepper hair underneath. Then he carefully pulled off the fake beard, the theatrical adhesive giving way to show the familiar facial features that Marcus had known since childhood. Finally, he removed the grey contact lenses with practiced movements, revealing the brown eyes that had looked at his son with love and pride for more than 26 years. The transformation was like watching a magic trick performed in reverse, the homeless man dissolving before Marcus's eyes to reveal someone he recognized with shock that quickly transformed into horror, panic, and the dawning realization of what had just occurred. The expensive phone slipped from Marcus's suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering loudly on the sidewalk as he stared at his father in complete disbelief and growing terror. "Dad," Marcus whispered, the single word carrying the enormous weight of dawning realization about what had just happened and what it meant for their relationship. What are you doing? Why are you dressed like that? This isn't real, is it?" William looked at his son with eyes that reflected profound sadness, disappointment, and a pain that went deeper than anything he had ever experienced in his personal or professional life. The love was still there, it would always be there, but it was now accompanied by a devastating understanding of who his son had become when he thought no one important was watching. "I came here to see who you really are, Marcus," William said quietly, his voice carrying clearly despite its low volume. "And now I know exactly what kind of person I raised. Now I understand what my success and wealth have actually accomplished." "You were testing me?" Marcus's voice cracked with the beginning of panic as he understood the full implications of what had just occurred and what his father had witnessed. This was some kind of sick experiment? Some twisted psychological manipulation? "No," William replied with devastating quietness, beginning to remove the rest of his disguise as curious passers-by started to notice the unusual and dramatic scene unfolding on the sidewalk. This was a father trying desperately to understand what had happened to his son, trying to find out if there was still any trace of compassion, empathy, or basic human decency left in the young man I thought I raised to be better than this. Marcus looked around frantically, as if hoping to find some way to undo what had just happened or escape the consequences of his revealed character. "Dad, I didn't know it was you. If I had known it was you, obviously I would have..." That's exactly the point, and that's what makes this so devastating," William interrupted, his voice heavy with disappointment that seemed to age him years in just moments. "You treated someone you thought was helpless and vulnerable with a level of cruelty that I didn't know you were capable of. The fact that it was me doesn't change what you said, how you said it, or what it reveals about your character." Now, the realization was written clearly across Marcus's face as he understood that there was no explanation that could excuse what had just happened, no rationalization that could minimize the significance of what his father had witnessed. He had revealed his true nature to the one person whose opinion mattered most to him, and that revelation was devastating in its clarity and completeness. "I can explain," Marcus began desperately, but his father held up a hand to stop him before he could continue with what would inevitably be empty justifications. "What exactly would you explain, Marcus?" William asked, his voice breaking slightly with emotion. "Would you explain why you think some human beings are inherently worth less than others? Would you explain why you feel entitled to treat people with cruelty based solely on their economic circumstances? Would you explain where you learned that having money makes you superior to those who don't have it?" Marcus had no answer, because there was no answer that could justify what William had witnessed. The young man who had seemed so confident, self-assured, and successful just minutes earlier now looked lost, small, and frightened, faced with the mirror of his father's disappointment and the reflection of his own moral failures. "I raised you to be better than this," William continued, his voice growing stronger and more resolute with each word. "I gave you every advantage, every opportunity, every privilege that money could buy. I thought I was preparing you for success and leadership, but somehow I failed completely to teach you the most basic lesson about being human." "What lesson?" Marcus asked weakly, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. that everyone deserves dignity and respect simply because they're human, William replied with the weight of absolute certainty. That compassion isn't something you give based on what someone can do for you or how they can advance your interests. That being privileged means you have a responsibility to help those who have less, not to despise them for their circumstances or blame them for problems you've never had to face. The conversation was beginning to attract significant attention from other people on the busy street, but William no longer cared about appearances, privacy, or potential embarrassment. This was too important, too fundamental to his understanding of who his son had become and what it meant for their relationship and Marcus's future as a human being. "Dad, please," Marcus pleaded, tears beginning to form in his eyes as the full weight of the situation settled on him. "I can change. This isn't who I really am deep down. I was just having a terrible day, and I didn't think clearly, and I... This isn't who you are," William asked, his tone sharpening with anger for the first time. "Marcus, I've been watching you treat people this way for months. The waitress at Mistral, the parking attendant at your building, the delivery drivers, the elderly homeless man I saw you push and humiliate 3 weeks ago, right here, in this exact spot. This isn't a bad day or poor judgment. This is a consistent pattern of behavior that shows me exactly who you've chosen to become." The mention of previous incidents hit Marcus like a series of physical blows as he realized his father had been observing and cataloguing his cruelty for an extended period. There was no single moment of poor judgment to excuse or explain away. There was a documented pattern of treating others badly based on their perceived social status and economic position. "I didn't know you were watching," Marcus whispered, the admission revealing that he understood the behavior was wrong, even as he continued it when he thought he could get away with it. "And that makes it infinitely worse, not better," William replied with devastating clarity. "You thought you could get away with being cruel as long as I didn't see it. You thought you could maintain one personality with me and your family while showing your true nature to people you thought didn't matter or couldn't hurt you." William began walking away from the building, no longer able to stand in the place where he had discovered such painful and devastating truths about his son's character. Marcus hurried to follow, his expensive shoes clicking desperately on the sidewalk as he tried to keep up with his father's determined stride. "Where are you going?" Marcus called after him, desperation and fear clear in his voice. "Back to Boston," William replied without turning around or slowing his pace. "I need time to think about what I've learned today and what it means for our relationship going forward." "Our relationship?" Marcus caught up and walked beside his father, his face pale with terror at the implications. "Dad, you can't let one mistake destroy everything between us. You can't let this ruin our family." William stopped walking and turned to face his son directly, his eyes reflecting a pain that went deeper than disappointment into something approaching grief. "One mistake? Marcus, you just told someone you thought was homeless and desperate that the world would be better off without them. You threatened to call the police on someone whose only crime was asking for food. You showed a level of cruelty and inhumanity that I didn't know existed in my own son." "But I didn't mean it," Marcus protested weakly, though his tone suggested even he didn't believe his own words. "Yes, you did," William replied with absolute certainty. "Every word, every gesture, every expression of disgust and contempt was completely genuine. That wasn't an act or a performance, Marcus. That was you showing me who you really are when you think no one important is watching or judging you." They had reached William's car, a modest rental sedan he had chosen for this mission, rather than one of his more recognizable luxury vehicles that might have given away his identity. As he opened the door, Marcus grabbed his arm with desperate urgency, his fingers gripping tightly as if he could physically prevent his father from leaving. "Don't leave like this," Marcus begged, his voice breaking with emotion. "Please don't abandon me. Let me fix this somehow. Let me prove to you that I can be better than what you saw today." William looked at his son's hand on his arm, then up at the young man's face, searching for signs of genuine understanding rather than just fear of consequences. For a moment, he saw traces of the sweet child Marcus had once been, and his heart ached with the memory of who his son might have become under different circumstances or with different values. "How?" William asked quietly but intensely. "How do you fix the fact that you feel fundamentally superior to other human beings based on their bank accounts and social status? How do you fix the fact that you think someone's worth is determined by their success rather than their character? How do you fix 26 years of learning to see people as either useful or disposable?" Marcus had no immediate answer because the questions cut to the heart of fundamental beliefs about human nature, social hierarchy, and moral responsibility that couldn't be changed with simple promises or quick fixes. The values that had shaped his worldview were deeply ingrained, reinforced by years of privilege, and surrounded by social circles that shared similar attitudes about wealth, success, and social hierarchy. "I don't know," Marcus admitted, his voice barely audible above the sounds of Manhattan traffic. "But I want to try. I need to try. I can't let this be the end of our relationship." William studied his son's face carefully, searching for signs of genuine understanding and remorse rather than just panic about potential consequences. What he saw was fear, embarrassment, and desperate desire to avoid losing his father's support, but he wasn't entirely sure if he saw the deeper recognition of moral failure that would be necessary for any real change to occur. "Marcus," William said carefully, weighing each word, "do you understand why what you did was fundamentally wrong, or are you just sorry that I caught you doing it?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge, forcing Marcus to examine his own motivations and feelings about what had just happened with brutal honesty. It was the kind of moral inventory that he had probably never been required to perform, raised as he had been in environments where success was valued above ethics and winning was more important than character. Marcus began, then stopped, clearly struggling with the honesty that the question required. "I think I understand that it was wrong, but I'm terrified of what this means for us, for our relationship." "Why do you think it was wrong?" William pressed, needing to understand the depth of his son's comprehension. Marcus was quiet for a long, uncomfortable moment, clearly wrestling with concepts and moral principles that didn't come naturally to him after years of privilege and entitlement. Because that person was already suffering, and instead of helping, or at least not making it worse, I deliberately caused more pain. Because I said things that were designed to hurt someone who was already hurt. It wasn't a complete or sophisticated answer, but it showed more self-awareness and moral reasoning than William had expected. There was at least some recognition that causing unnecessary suffering was wrong, even if Marcus didn't yet understand the broader principles about human dignity, equality, and social responsibility. "That's a start," William acknowledged, though his tone remained guarded and skeptical. "But it's only the beginning, Marcus. Understanding that you caused pain is different from understanding why all people deserve compassion and respect, regardless of their circumstances or what they can do for you." "Then teach me," Marcus said, his voice taking on a desperate, pleading edge. "I know I don't understand something that seems obvious and natural to you. Help me learn what I missed. Show me how to be the person you wanted me to become." William felt a small flicker of hope at his son's words, but it was tempered by the knowledge of how difficult it would be to undo years of conditioning, privilege, and moral development that had gone so terribly wrong. Values and character weren't just intellectual concepts that could be explained in a single conversation. They had to be lived, practiced, and reinforced through experience, reflection, and consistent choices. "It's not that simple, Marcus," William replied honestly. "This isn't like learning a new business strategy or mastering a technical skill. This is about fundamental beliefs about human worth, dignity, and our responsibilities to each other. It's about developing genuine empathy for people whose experiences and struggles are completely different from yours. But people can change, right? Marcus asked, clinging to hope that this wasn't permanent or irreversible. People can learn to be better than they were before. William considered the question carefully, drawing on his observations of human nature throughout his life and career. He had seen people change dramatically throughout his years, sometimes for the better and sometimes for the worse, but usually only when they were forced to confront the consequences of their actions and truly understand the harm they had caused. Some people can change, William said finally, but only if they really want to, and only if they're willing to do the hard, uncomfortable work of examining their beliefs and challenging themselves to see the world differently. It's not enough to say you want to change because you got caught doing something wrong or because you're afraid of losing something important. What would that look like? Marcus asked eagerly. The hard work, I mean. What would I need to do? William thought carefully about the question as he considered what it might realistically take to help his son develop the empathy, compassion, and moral reasoning that seemed to be missing from his character. It wouldn't be enough to read books, attend lectures, or make financial donations. Marcus needed experiences that would force him to see the world from radically different perspectives. It would mean spending significant time with people whose lives are completely different from yours, William said slowly. It would mean listening to their stories, understanding their struggles, and recognizing their humanity and dignity, even when they can't offer you anything in return. It would mean confronting your assumptions about poverty, success, and human worth. Marcus nodded eagerly, seeming to grasp onto this concrete suggestion like a lifeline. I could do that. I could volunteer somewhere, work with people who need help. I could learn about issues I've never had to face. Could you? William asked skeptically, his tone challenging. Could you spend time with people experiencing homelessness without feeling superior to them? Could you serve food at a soup kitchen without judging the people in line? Could you listen to someone's story of hardship without assuming it was their fault or that they deserved their circumstances? The questions forced Marcus to imagine himself in situations that would have been completely foreign to his previous experience and worldview. He had never spent meaningful time with people who were struggling financially, never had his assumptions about poverty and success challenged by real human faces and stories, never been required to see past stereotypes to recognize individual humanity. I don't know, Marcus admitted honestly, perhaps for the first time in the conversation. But I want to find out. I want to try to be the person you raised me to be instead of whatever I've become. William felt his heart soften slightly at his son's words, though he remained cautious about putting too much faith in promises made in the heat of crisis and panic. Real change would take time, sustained effort, and consistent choices to prioritize compassion over convenience and comfort. If you really mean that, William said carefully, then we can talk about what that might realistically look like. But Marcus, I need you to understand that this isn't about getting back in my good graces or avoiding consequences for your behavior. This has to be about you genuinely wanting to become a better person, regardless of what it means for our relationship. I do want that, Marcus said, and for the first time, William heard something in his son's voice that sounded like authentic remorse and genuine desire for change, rather than just fear of punishment or loss. I don't like who I've become. I don't like the person who could say those horrible things to someone who was asking for help. It was a small admission, but it represented the first crack in the armor of entitlement and superiority that had seemed so impenetrable just minutes earlier. William realized that perhaps there was still hope for his son, though the road to redemption would be long, difficult, and uncertain. All right, William said, making a decision that felt both hopeful and terrifying. We'll try. But this has to be on my terms, Marcus. You'll need to do exactly what I ask, when I ask it, without arguments, excuses, or attempts to negotiate. And if I see any sign that you're just going through the motions or trying to manipulate the situation to your advantage, we're done permanently." Marcus nodded vigorously, relief evident on his face despite the stringent conditions. "Anything, Dad. I'll do whatever it takes. I can't lose you over this." William looked at his son, still seeing traces of the makeup and costume that had revealed such painful truths about Marcus's character, but also beginning to see the possibility of redemption and change. The disguise had served its devastating purpose, but now the real work would begin, the much harder task of helping his son replace his cruelty with genuine compassion. "Get in the car," William said, opening the passenger door. "We're going to start right now, today." "Start what?" Marcus asked as he climbed into the vehicle. "Your education in basic human decency," William replied grimly, but with determination. "We're going to spend the rest of today visiting places where people who have less than you are trying to survive and rebuild their lives, and you're going to listen to their stories without judgment." As they drove through Manhattan traffic toward their first destination, William felt a complex mixture of emotions about what lay ahead. The test had revealed devastating truths about his son's character, but it had also opened the door to a conversation and process that might not have been possible otherwise. For the first time in months, he felt like he was talking to Marcus about something that really mattered, something that could potentially transform both of their lives. Their first stop was the Bowery Mission, a homeless shelter and soup kitchen in Lower Manhattan where William had previously made anonymous donations and volunteered occasionally. As they walked through the doors, Marcus visibly tensed at the unfamiliar environment and the people around him, who looked nothing like his usual social circle of wealthy, successful professionals. "Remember," William said quietly as they approached the volunteer coordinator, "you're here to listen and learn, not to judge, fix, or save anyone. These are people with stories, experiences, wisdom, and dignity that you've never been exposed to in your privileged world." The volunteer coordinator, a woman named Sarah Rodriguez, who had been working with homeless populations for over 15 years, welcomed them warmly and explained how they could help with the evening meal service. As they put on aprons and hairnets and began serving food, William watched his son's reactions and body language carefully. Marcus's initial discomfort was obvious and painful to watch. He handled the serving utensils gingerly, avoided eye contact with the people in line, and seemed to be fighting his instinct to recoil from the unfamiliar sights, sounds, and smells of poverty and desperation. But as the evening progressed and he was forced to interact with person after person, William noticed small but significant changes. His son began to respond to people's expressions of gratitude with nods and even tentative smiles. When an elderly woman told him she was grateful for the warm meal and kind service, Marcus seemed genuinely moved by the simple expression of appreciation. When a young father thanked him for the extra portion he had given to help feed his children, Marcus's eyes showed the first glimmer of understanding about the reality of food insecurity in America. During a break in the service, Sarah introduced them to Robert Washington, a man in his 50s who'd been living on the streets for 8 months after losing his job as a construction foreman and being unable to find new employment despite his skills and experience. Robert's story was heartbreakingly common. A workplace injury had led to medical bills that consumed his life savings, followed by depression and PTSD that made it difficult to maintain relationships, housing, and employment. William watched his son's face intently as Robert spoke with quiet dignity about the daily challenges of life without shelter, the constant search for food and safe places to sleep, the way people looked through him as if he didn't exist, the loss of identity and self-worth that came with being reduced to society's most despised category. "The hardest part," Robert said, his voice quiet but steady, "isn't being hungry or cold or even afraid. It's being invisible. It's having people look at you like you're not human, like you're something disgusting they want to step around and forget about as quickly as possible." The words hit Marcus visibly, and William realized his son was remembering his own behavior from earlier that day, and probably from many other encounters. The abstract concept of homelessness was becoming personal, connected to a real person with a name, a history, feelings that could be hurt, and dignity that deserved respect. After they finished their volunteer shift, William and Marcus sat in the car outside the shelter, both processing what they had experienced in very different ways. Marcus was unusually quiet, staring out the window at people walking past on the sidewalk, with an expression William had never seen before. "What are you thinking about?" William asked. "That man, Robert," Marcus replied slowly, his voice thoughtful rather than dismissive. "He used to have a job, an apartment, a normal life that probably looked a lot like mine in some ways. And now He trailed off, struggling to articulate what he was beginning to understand. "Now he's what?" William prompted gently. "Now he's someone that people like me treat like garbage," Marcus finished quietly, his voice heavy with the beginning of shame and recognition. "Someone I would have said didn't deserve help or respect or basic human dignity." Oh, it wasn't a complete transformation of worldview, but it was significant progress. Marcus was beginning to make the crucial connection between abstract categories like homeless people and real individuals with complex stories, inherent dignity, and the right to compassion. The process of developing genuine empathy was slow and uncomfortable, but William could see it beginning to happen. Over the following weeks, William structured a carefully planned series of experiences designed to continue Marcus's education in human compassion and social responsibility. They visited food banks where Marcus met working families who struggled to afford groceries despite having full-time jobs. They spent time at community centers in low-income neighborhoods where Marcus tutored children whose educational opportunities were severely limited by their families' financial circumstances and systemic inequalities. Each experience was designed to force Marcus to confront his assumptions about poverty, success, and human worth through direct contact with people whose lives contradicted his simplistic beliefs about individual responsibility and meritocracy. He met people who worked multiple jobs but still couldn't make ends meet, parents who sacrificed their own basic needs to provide for their children, individuals who maintained dignity and kindness despite facing struggles that Marcus had never imagined possible. The changes in Marcus were gradual, but increasingly noticeable to those who knew him well. He began asking thoughtful questions about the systemic issues that contributed to inequality, rather than simply assuming that people's circumstances were entirely their own fault. He started treating service workers with basic courtesy and respect, remembering their names and thanking them genuinely for their efforts. Most importantly, he began to see people as individuals with their own stories, rather than representatives of economic or social categories. But the real test of his transformation came 3 months after the initial devastating confrontation, when William suggested they return to the exact same corner where the homeless test had taken place. This time, they went not in disguise or deception, but as themselves, carrying sandwiches, warm coffee, and small care packages to distribute to anyone who needed them. As they offered food and supplies to people on the street, William watched his son interact with individuals experiencing homelessness with what appeared to be genuine respect, compassion, and interest in their well-being. Marcus listened to their stories without judgment, asked about their immediate needs, and treated each person as someone worthy of dignity and attention, rather than as an object of pity or disgust. When they encountered a man who looked remarkably similar to how William had appeared in his disguise, Marcus knelt down to speak with him at eye level, offering not just food, but conversation, respect, and acknowledgement of his humanity and worth. Watching his son show such genuine compassion to someone who couldn't offer anything in return filled William with a pride and hope he hadn't felt in years. "Thank you," the man said to Marcus after accepting a sandwich, coffee and toiletry kit. "Not just for the food and supplies, but for treating me like a person. That means more than you probably realize." Later, as they walked back to their car, Marcus was quiet and reflective, clearly processing the experience and its connection to his previous behavior. "I keep thinking about what I said to you that day," he admitted, his voice heavy with shame and regret. "When I thought you were just some homeless person asking for help." "What about it?" William asked. "I told you the world would be better off without people like you," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I actually said that to someone who was asking for food. I threatened to call the police on someone whose only crime was being hungry and desperate. I can't believe I was capable of that level of cruelty and inhumanity." William stopped walking and turned to face his son directly. "But you're not that person anymore, are you?" Marcus considered the question carefully before answering, understanding that his response needed to be thoughtful and honest, rather than just what his father wanted to hear. "I hope not. I'm trying desperately not to be, but I realize now that it's not enough to just stop being cruel or indifferent. I have to actively choose compassion and empathy every day, especially when it's difficult, inconvenient, or doesn't benefit me personally." "That's exactly right," William said, feeling genuinely proud of his son for the first time in months. "Compassion isn't just a feeling, Marcus. It's a choice, and it's a daily practice. You have to work at it constantly, especially when you have privilege, power, and the option to ignore other people's suffering." Their relationship had been fundamentally transformed by the experience of that devastating test and its challenging aftermath. William had discovered painful truths about his son's character that had shaken him to his core, but he had also learned that people could change dramatically when they were willing to do the difficult work of examining their beliefs and challenging themselves to grow beyond their limitations. Marcus had learned that his privilege came with serious moral responsibilities, that his professional success meant nothing if it wasn't coupled with compassion and service to others, and that everyone he encountered deserved to be treated with basic human dignity, regardless of their circumstances, appearance, or ability to benefit him. The process of transformation hadn't been easy or linear. There had been setbacks, moments when Marcus reverted to old patterns of thinking and behavior, and conversations that were difficult and sometimes painful for both of them. But gradually, consistently, through sustained effort and genuine commitment, he had developed the empathy and compassion that had been so conspicuously missing from his character. A year later, Marcus made a decision that shocked everyone in his professional and social circles. He left his lucrative, high-status position at Goldman Sachs to work for a non-profit organization focused on affordable housing development and homelessness prevention. The decision meant a dramatic reduction in income and social status, but it also meant using his skills, education, and connections for purposes that aligned with his newly developed values and sense of purpose. William had never been prouder of his son than when Marcus announced his career change during one of their regular monthly dinners. The young man who had once shown such shocking cruelty to people experiencing homelessness was now dedicating his professional life to addressing the systemic issues that created and perpetuated homelessness in American society. "Do you ever regret it?" William asked during their dinner conversation, referring to Marcus's decision to leave the lucrative world of investment banking. "Either the career change or the process that led to it." "Which part?" Marcus replied with a slight knowing smile. "Leaving Goldman Sachs or becoming someone you could be proud of again?" "Either. Both. All of it." Marcus considered the question thoughtfully, understanding that his father was asking about more than just career choices. "I regret that it took such a dramatic and painful wake-up call for me to realize how far I'd strayed from the values you tried to teach me. I regret deeply all the people I hurt with my arrogance, cruelty, and indifference before I learned to be better. But I don't regret any of the changes I've made in my life, even though they weren't easy and sometimes felt impossible. What was the hardest part of changing? William asked. Admitting that most of my success wasn't really mine, Marcus answered with brutal honesty. Recognizing that I had enormous advantages from birth that other people never got, and that those advantages didn't make me superior to anyone else. Learning to see my privilege as responsibility rather than entitlement, and understanding that I had been taking credit for accomplishments that were partly the result of opportunities I'd been given rather than earned. William nodded, understanding that this kind of recognition was perhaps the most difficult aspect of personal growth for someone who had been raised with significant advantages and had never been required to examine the sources of their success. "And what's been the most rewarding part?" William prompted. "Discovering that helping other people, making a real difference in their lives, gives me more satisfaction than any amount of money or status ever did," Marcus replied without hesitation. "Learning that my life has infinitely more meaning when it's connected to something larger than my own success and comfort." Their conversation was interrupted by their waiter, a young man who appeared to be working his way through college while supporting his family. Marcus thanked him warmly for his service, asked genuinely interested questions about his studies and goals, and engaged in the kind of authentic human interaction that would have been completely impossible for the person he used to be. After the waiter left their table, William reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought them to this point. The homeless test had been one of the most painful and devastating experiences of his life as a father, revealing truths about his son's character that had shattered his heart and called into question everything he thought he knew about parenting and values. But it had also created the opportunity for Marcus to confront those truths honestly and choose to become someone fundamentally better than he had been. The test had been a catalyst for transformation that might never have happened otherwise, despite its initial devastating impact on both of their lives. "I've been thinking about that day," William said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of memory and reflection. "When I dressed up to test you." "What about it?" Marcus asked, though his expression showed he knew the conversation was heading toward territory they had explored many times, but never fully resolved. "I've wondered sometimes if I was wrong to deceive you like that, if it was manipulative, unfair, or even cruel to test you without your knowledge or consent." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering his response carefully and honestly. "I used to think it was unfair," he admitted. "Right after it happened, I felt betrayed and angry that you had deceived me and put me in that situation without warning. And now? How do you feel about it now?" "Now I realize that you only revealed what I was already doing when I thought no one important was watching," Marcus said with complete honesty. "The test didn't make me cruel to homeless people or anyone else. It just revealed the cruelty that was already there, fully formed and actively being practiced. If anything, you gave me the opportunity to see myself clearly and choose to change before it was too late." William felt a weight lifting from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying for over a year. The guilt about deceiving his son had been a constant presence in his mind, despite the ultimately positive changes that had resulted from the devastating experience. "Do you think other people should do what I did?" William asked. "Test their children or loved ones to see their true character?" Marcus considered the question carefully, understanding its broader implications. "I think most people reveal their true character without being tested, if you pay attention and are willing to see what's really there. You had been watching me treat people badly for months before the test. You just needed confirmation of what you already suspected. The real question isn't whether to test people, but what you do with the information once you have it." "What do you mean?" "Some parents might have just written off their child as irredeemably selfish and cruel. Others might have ignored the behavior and hoped it would magically improve on its own. You chose the much harder path of actually trying to help me change, even when it was uncomfortable, uncertain, and required enormous effort from both of us." William realized that his son was absolutely right. The test itself had been less important than his decision to use the results as a starting point for growth and transformation, rather than as a reason to give up on their relationship. Many parents might not have been willing to invest the time, emotional energy, and personal risk required to help their adult child examine and change fundamental aspects of their character and worldview. "I almost gave up on you," William admitted honestly. "When I saw how you treated that person you thought was me, I wasn't sure there was anything left worth saving or fighting for." "What changed your mind? What made you decide to try?" "You did," William replied without hesitation. "When you asked if you could change and seemed genuinely willing to do whatever work was required, regardless of how difficult or uncomfortable it might be, that convinced me that underneath all the arrogance and entitlement, there might still be traces of the compassionate child I raised." "Were you right?" Marcus asked with a knowing smile. William looked at his son, seeing not just the professionally successful young man he had become, but the caring, compassionate person he had grown into through sustained effort and genuine commitment to change. The journey had been difficult for both of them, requiring honest conversations about privilege, responsibility, and human dignity that many families never have and many individuals never face. "Yes," William said with absolute certainty, "I was completely right. You were worth fighting for, even when it seemed hopeless." As they finished their dinner and prepared to leave the restaurant, William reflected on the strange, unpredictable ways that life could unfold. A desperate test, born from parental disappointment and fear, had become the catalyst for one of the most meaningful transformations he had ever witnessed. His son had learned to see beyond his privilege, to recognize and honor the humanity in everyone he encountered. Most importantly, Marcus had learned to use his advantages as tools for helping others rather than weapons for maintaining superiority over them. The wealth, education, and connections that had once isolated him from others' experiences now enabled him to be more effective in addressing systemic problems and creating positive change in the world. And if you're wondering whether you would pass such a test yourself, remember that every single day presents us with opportunities to choose compassion over indifference, dignity over superiority, and service over self-interest. The real test isn't in dramatic moments like this story, but in the daily choices we make about how to treat the people around us, especially those who can offer us nothing in return. This story reminds us that change is possible even in the most difficult circumstances, that privilege comes with serious moral responsibilities, and that the true measure of our success isn't what we achieve for ourselves, but how we use our advantages to lift others up and make the world more just and compassionate. If this story has moved you to think differently about compassion, character, and the choices we make every day, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell for more life-changing stories that will challenge your assumptions and inspire you to be better. Because in the end, we all have the choice to be better than we were yesterday, and sometimes it takes a devastating revelation to show us who we really are and who we have the potential to become.